Okay, let's make a start. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar, which is being run by the Campaign for Social Science as part of its broader Election 24 series. I'm Heather Rolfe, I'm Director of Research at the think tank British Future. So a little bit about the Campaign for Social Science, for those of you who don't know it. It demonstrates how social science informs and improves public policy, society, and all of our lives. And it highlights the value of applied social science research and advocates for its greater use in decision-making and in government. And the campaign is supported by a coalition of universities, social science societies, and publishers. And it promotes the benefits of investing in social science to deliver evidence-based solutions to the significant challenges and opportunities facing our society. So ahead of a likely UK general election next year, the campaign is seeking to communicate and showcase social science research in ways that will help the next government, whatever its political makeup. It will help it to benefit from the insights of social scientists. So today's seminar will contribute towards that as we allow our panel to speak directly with an audience of policymakers and civil society on a topic where their expertise can really inform policy development. So we're focusing on immigration, a topic that continues to be a salient one for voters, and it's very likely to feature strongly in the general election campaign. We've got a brilliant lineup of speakers with in-depth understanding of the research, the policy and the practice, and those are all important to developing and implementing an immigration system that works. So with their contributions, the webinar will explore and discuss what academic research tells us about immigration to the UK. And this includes, importantly, both what the public think about the topic and the considerations which should inform politics and policy making on immigration. And these might be economic and social as well as political. So let me introduce the panel, all of whom are fellows of the Academy of Social Sciences. So Professor Heaven Crawley is Head of Equitable Development and Migration at the United Nations University Centre for Policy Research. She also holds a chair in international migration at Coventry University Centre for Trust, Peace and Social Relations. Heaven is a leading expert on asylum and refugee issues, migrants' rights, and the politics of immigration policy making, all extremely topical and central to the challenges of a future government. Professor Paul Whiteley is Emeritus Professor at Essex University's Department of Government, and he's held senior posts at the universities of Bristol, Arizona, Virginia and Sheffield, quite a mix there, among others. And he has expertise on electoral voting behaviour, public opinion, political economy and political methodology. And Paul is very well placed to provide insights on public opinion and voting behaviour and the influence of this on a future government. Last but never least is Lord David Blunkett, who was Labour MP for Sheffield, Brightside and Hillsborough from 1987 to 2015. And during his distinguished parliamentary career, he served as Education and Employment Secretary, Work and Pension Secretary, and of greatest relevance to today's discussion, as Home Secretary from 2001 to 2004, quite a stint considering the short lifespans of our current Home Secretaries. And he was MP at the time when the points-based system was first introduced in 2008. He's also a member of the House of Lords Justice and Home Affairs Select Committee, which covers immigration and asylum, among other issues. And as well as sitting in the House of Lords, he's Professor of Politics and Practice at Sheffield University. And so he also has an academic grounding on the issues that we're discussing today, and particularly the extent to which policy should be informed by research evidence, including on public attitudes. So, with that introduction, over to our first speaker, Heaven Crawley.
Thank you very much, Heather. Thank you for the introduction, for the invitation from the Academy of Social Sciences to speak at this event, and for the opportunity to be on a panel with Lord Blunkett for the first time since I worked with him actually at the Home Office when he was then Home Secretary in the early 2000s, as you mentioned, and I was leading asylum research at what was then the Home Office's Immigration Research and Statistics Service, the IRSS. So I've been asked by the organisers to outline some of the key themes and findings from academic research on migration within a UK context and what policymakers should learn from it. And I certainly intend to do that. But my starting point really is that these three issues are the focus of today's discussion: the research, the polling, and the politics of migration are very intricately connected in the UK, as indeed they are elsewhere. And the reason for that, I've argued in my own research, is that migration has effectively become what you might call a touchstone issue for a whole range of other issues impacting society and the daily lives of its citizens. So everything from access to housing and healthcare, to equality and security of employment, and to people's day-to-day interactions, of course, within their communities. And I think it's important to acknowledge at the outset that there's been a huge number of changes taking place in the UK, as indeed elsewhere, over the last 30 years, at the very same time that the scale and diversity of migration has increased. So there are changes associated, if you like, with late-stage capitalism, not least the growth of the gig economy, zero-hour contracts, changes in public service provision, privatization. And I think very importantly for this conversation and any government is a changing kind of relationship of the state to its populations in some way. And all of this against a backdrop where issues of global security, or should I say insecurity, have become more important. And then, of course, there's been the rise of the internet and social media and changes in the way in which we communicate knowledge about all sorts of issues, migration just being one of them. So I think in the context of all of that change, migration has really become a very visible sign of what's going on in the world, even though migration might not be responsible for it, if you like. So in other words, what people think about migration is shaped by issues that go well beyond migration itself, even assuming that people understand how many people are coming and what the impacts of that migration are. And I'm sure that Professor Whiteley will say much more about that in his intervention. The second contextual issue I want to put on the table in a way is what you alluded to, Heather, in your introduction, namely the relationship between research and policy making. So over the last 30 years, and especially since the late 1990s, when New Labour came into power, there's really been an emphasis on evidence-based policy making, on the idea of ensuring that policies are based on evidence about what works, processes, what we know about outcomes. And alongside that, we've really seen a change in academia, to be honest. The amount of money that universities get now is really directly related to how much their research has an impact on policymaking. But I think in truth, the relationship between evidence and policymaking is very rarely clear and often not direct. It's a really complex process, as I know Lord Blunkett will tell us about, and it's driven ultimately, probably, by political goals and aspirations. It reflects all kinds of evidence, not just academic evidence, and it's very rarely linear. Excuse me. And in my experience, I would say something more akin to policy-based evidence-making has become a more practice, which is really to say that the kinds of research that's been undertaken is often being done so to inform or confirm policy decision-making, increasingly by those who are giving the funding. So given the limitations of time, I want to illustrate these points, which I accept are not uncontroversial, by reference to specific policy issues that have dominated the UK policy scene for at least as long as I've been working in this area. And the issue that I want to focus on is really the issue of why people come to the UK, and specifically why they come to the UK to claim asylum. And why have I decided to focus on this issue? Well, primarily, I think it's because it's an area where I have a lot of research experience and where I think there is a really striking lack of a relationship between evidence and policy, and also perhaps an area where the politics of migration is most heavily skewed. So in a way, let's set the scene. And I know, again, Professor Whiteley will talk a bit more about this in detail in his presentation. International migration, it's roughly stayed the same in terms of percentage of the world's population for the last 30 years, roughly 3.5%. But of course, the population of the world has increased significantly, and the amount of migration to the UK, as elsewhere, has also increased, really as a reflection of the increasing depth and extension of relationship between places. And I think it's fair to say, and you might recognize this in the audience, that migration is increasing in a way regardless of what politicians try to do to stop it. And I think that's nowhere more evident than in the 2022 net migration figures. In other words, the number of people moving into the country versus those minus those moving out. So in 2022, this figure reached 1,000 people, a 24% increase from 2021, and roughly double the rate of net migration in the years before the 2016 Brexit referendum, when, of course, migration and slowing down the rate of migration was a principal agenda item. Now, most of these people, very importantly, moved to the UK entirely legally for reasons of family reunion, for education, and because the UK, frankly, has major labour shortages. And that's partly to do with demographic change. It's partly to do with increased education of the British-born population. It's to do with the strength of UK universities, which attract large numbers of international students. Now, importantly, the proportion of refugees and asylum seekers in the UK as a percentage of all migration is actually very low. And it's very low, of course, in terms of the number of refugees that there are in the world. Around 70%, of all refugees are hosted in the global south. And until the Russian invasion of Ukraine last February, that figure was actually something closer to 85%. So refugees are a tiny proportion of the UK population, but I would argue that they attract a disproportionate amount of policy interest and media anxiety. And one of the policy narratives that's very strong in this area is the underlying assumption that people are pulled or drawn to the UK either by benefits or by the possibility of work, often both at the same time, and that therefore the policy response is that you need to reduce the pull factor in order to, if you like, take away people's rights, including the right to work, which I'll come on to, so that people don't come anymore and those that come are legitimately in need of protection. And what I want to suggest is that based on all of my research, and actually a huge amount of research that's been done over the last 30 years, all of the evidence, and including evidence commissioned by the Home Office when I was working there, shows that the factors shaping asylum decision-making are incredibly complicated. So Home Office research that I was involved in, published in 2002, so nearly 2 decades ago, shows that actually perceptions of the UK, of family connections, and particularly of language, really are very critical in determining whether or not people decide to make the laborious journey to the UK. And I was involved in a big program of research in 2015 during the so-called refugee or migration crisis in Europe, funded by the ESRC, which again tried to look at the migration drivers of more than 1 million people into Europe. And again, we found very clearly that there is a strong relationship between conflict and asylum decision-making, and that most people originate from countries where there's conflict and well-documented human rights abuse. And again, that family connections and language are the factors, the main factors that shape the decisions of the very small proportion, actually, of people who end up in Europe, or within that end up in the UK. I think it's also important to note here that most of those who apply for asylum, about 72% in 2021, actually get it. So in fact, they are genuinely in need of protection. They are not economic migrants that is often claimed. So why does any of this matter? Well, I think it matters, and I'm conscious of the time, because essentially a lot of the policy making in this space doesn't take account of the evidence, and it uses the issue of asylum, I would argue, to play to public concerns and anxieties about the impacts of migration, and it's ultimately reflected in poor policy choices that don't address the issues that are actually at hand. 3 examples briefly, and we can come back to them. The right to work has been shown time and time again not to influence people's decision-making. It's not why people come. Yes, they expect to support themselves, but my research for the Refugee Council shows that that is not a driver, and in fact, they often don't realise they're not allowed to work when they arrive. A recent policy decision to set up a deal with Rwanda to remove those who arrive irregularly, I think really is a real distraction from some of the key issues of how to resolve the problems in the asylum system. And it actually, again, accounts for a very tiny proportion of all people who will be claiming asylum. And yet, in terms of the public debate, actually is quite harmful, not least because it undermines global standards. And I think the small boat policy, the rhetoric around that, is symptomatic of the same problems. I've written for years about the issue of originally Sangatte and more recently what's been going on in Calais, and how this really is very problematic because it ignores the fact that there are no safe or legal routes for people to make the crossing, even where they have very clear connections to UK and including in some cases children. So just by way of conclusion, I think what's really clear to me is that political leadership is critical on the issue of migration, and that from my experience, which goes back now something like 35 years, terrifyingly, the problem is not that we have a lack of evidence to inform policy making, but rather that we have a reluctance at best, and I think an active resistance in some cases, to take account of that evidence, because the politics of asylum has become very pernicious. And as I said at the beginning, it's become a touchstone for other issues. We know that the UK has benefited from migration. I believe that the politicians, not just in the UK, regardless of political persuasion, have essentially backed themselves into a policy corner where it makes it very hard to do good policy making. And that given that migration is not going away, what we really need is political leadership on this issue. And that would then allow us to take account of some of the evidence we have to ensure that we have, you know, better and more appropriate policy making in this space. I'll stop there in the interest of time. Much more I could say, but thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Heaven. Some really important points there about how the asylum and refugee issue has gone right up the political agenda. And then we have the government not really focused on evidence, should we say, not really listening to public opinion, but also probably adding toxicity to the debate by not proposing sensible, workable solutions. So thank you very much. I'd like now to hand over to Professor Paul Whiteley, who, as I've said, has expertise on public opinion and voting behaviour. And I think Paul has got some slides that he'd like to present to us. So over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Heather. I'm going to do something I've been doing a lot with students and reverse the screen and walk through some slides that throw light on what we are saying. So this is what I'm addressing. What's the state of immigration into Britain and what do the public think about it? Okay. This is the background information that Heaven earlier referred to. Latest estimates are that 1.2 million migrated in UK and 557,000 emigrated last year in 2022, and therefore you get this net migration figure of 606,000 at the end of June. And this is, of course, a balance between migrants moving in and out. In terms of the implications, this means that in the year up to June 2021, 6 million people were living in the UK who had a nationality of a different country. And this doesn't include people with joint nationality. Of course, a number were EU nationals, but it's about 9% of the population. Okay. This is estimates of international migration into the UK between 1964 and 2022, just to put this in context. So we've got background figures. These are figures in thousands. Okay, so you can see starting in 1964, the net migration, which is the purple one, the difference between immigration and emigration, was hovering around zero in effect for quite a while, and it started to rise in the late 90s and in particular in the 2000s. And what's happened is since the pandemic eased, we've had a very big jump in the numbers. And that's where it gets to this 606,000 that we've been talking about. So that's the kind of background. How about the political effects of immigration in terms of voting behaviour? Well, this comes from our book on Brexit, published recently. We asked questions in surveys about the top 3 issues which were preoccupying people during the 2019 general election. So people select from a list of issues. So this tells us about what are the salient issues. And as you can see, not surprisingly, in 2019, Brexit was the most salient, suggested by 61% of respondents. Health came second, economic issues, and they were diverse, you know, inflation, growth and stuff, but nonetheless, the economy. Third, and here we are, immigration was fourth with 23%. And then there's various others, as you can see in the list, of declining importance. So that was the 2019 election. What's happened since? Now, this looks a little chaotic, but let me just pick up the point that this goes back to 2016, and the purple line here is polling-based information about the public's perception of the four most important issues. So moving from three most important to the four most important. And you can see, not surprisingly, after the referendum, Brexit came top. And it continued to that until the time of the 2019 election, which was late in that year, December. And after the Conservatives won the election by a big number, it fell off a cliff. The second most important issue, the green one, the economy. That's always up there, pretty important in most elections. And as you can see, it rose quite high more recently. Third most was NHS, not surprisingly, with all the problems that it's been facing. So we went from a position in 2019 where Brexit dominated to it's disappeared almost. And the three top issues are the economy, the NHS, and the third is immigration. Now, just a quick caveat. People think that elections are influenced by lots and lots of issues, but it's not really true. 3 or 4 issues dominate. And the rest, you know, transport, housing, whatever, some people pick them up, but they're minor. And a law of politics is that parties are not going to concentrate on issues where there's only minor interest in it. They're going to focus heavily on the big issues, which people perceive as being important. Okay. We did a survey in 2021 asking people about which of the following statements comes closest to your view. This was a survey of the entire electorate. So it tells us what Britain thinks in terms of, this is just for Britain, we didn't do Northern Ireland. Which of the following statements comes closest to your view? Britain should increase the number of immigrants coming to the country. Just under 10% thought that. The current number of immigrants coming to Britain is about right. That was about 30%. Britain should reduce the number of immigrants coming to the country, and that was about 45%. And then you have a group of don't knows. So it's pretty clear at that time, people were skewed against immigration overall with this broad brush kind of question. Now, more recent data relating to, well, before I get to that, this is the perceived consequences of leaving the European Union in 2021. And I put this up because it's about a slightly different topic, but it's very striking. The black lines show that people would be negative about the consequences in question. So on personal finances, 30% thought that it would get worse. Their own personal finances would get worse as a result of leaving. 14% thought that it would be positive. And as you can see, the big item is the people who thought it was just about the same. And the same is true in immigration here. In this case, 10% thought that there would be negative consequences, and 42% thought there would be positive consequences. And this is some years after the referendum took place. The other issues don't matter, but the story of this, which you can look at later online, is people were still optimistic that immigration would be an issue that would be resolved in 2021. And the most recent data from the British Social Attitudes shows the number of people who thought the economic impact of immigration would be good or bad, and the number of people who thought the cultural impact on British society would be good or bad. Would it be enriched or undermined? Basic story is there's a majority in both cases thinking that it would be bad or very bad. Conclusions. Dramatic increase in immigration over the last 3 years. As far as public concerned, immigration is currently the third most important issue facing the country. So it's going to be an issue in the next general election. In the 2019 general election, immigration came fourth, but now it's moved into third place and may move up further, depends. Voters are more than 4 times as likely to say immigration should be reduced as to say it should be increased. Some 5 years after the Brexit referendum, many voters who thought that the economy overall, their own personal finances, and Britain's standing in the world would suffer as a result of Brexit were still optimistic that it would bring down immigration. And of course, the failure of the present government to achieve that is one of the factors which explains why it's so far behind, about 20 points behind Labour in voting intentions at the moment.
Thank you very much, Paul, for your insights. And I think you're absolutely right that a few issues are going to dominate the next election, and immigration is very likely to be one of them, hence this seminar. So thank you very much. I now have enormous pleasure in introducing Lord David Blunkett, who has a particularly in-depth operational understanding of the politics of immigration and the policy-making process. So over to you, David.
Thank you very much. It's nice to reconnect with Heaven from the Home Office days and Paul, of course, from University of Sheffield days. Heaven spelt out the misconceptions, at least in part, of the electorate in terms of what numbers we're talking about, particularly in terms of those who are by necessity coming to Britain because they don't have the authorised papers and the passport to be able to come through what you might describe as normal means. That is much broader, I think, in terms of what Paul's described about people's concerns, and that misconception and that lack of understanding about the reality of just what the numbers mean, and when you dissect them, where those numbers come from, is pretty important. I just want to make 2 points first, which is that the issue of migration and the associated but less prominent issue discussed about racism do go hand in hand. The figures that Paul gave from 1964 are very interesting because the then Labour government in 1968, Roy Jenkins drew up the white paper, but Jim Callaghan implemented it as an act, was a response to what was taking place internally in the UK. Whereas from 2015, when the Syrian influx into Germany gave those on the right the cover to be able to describe what they perceived or they were prepared to peddle as being the likelihood of hundreds of thousands of people coming into the UK from that million people who were welcomed into Germany, undoubtedly had an impact on the referendum and on subsequent thinking, because the referendum itself was at least in part fought on migration grounds and the issues around what would happen with Turkey. So there's 2 sorts of politics, and that's overlaid, of course, by moments in time which Heaven will remember were in my time, were the migration flows from Afghanistan and Iraq, which led us to the agreement about the closure of the Sangatte camp, the decision to take 1,000 of those from the camp into the UK, and the subsequent reduction in those coming across the Channel from around 84,000 in 2002 to something around 34,000 in 2004. Now, we were trying through the policy paper secure borders safe haven, which Nick Pearce, who's now Professor of Politics at Bath, and he was my special advisor, we're trying to put together, was to try and have a holistic approach so that you offered work permits. And of course, we were encouraging students from around the world to come to our university. We actually have a drive when I was Education and Employment Secretary on that back in the year 2000. We were encouraging other routes, including responding to crises like the one in Liberia and the genocide. And we set up what was then the United Nations with the UNHCR, the United Nations Gateway. Had that been expanded and had we been able to scale that, I think we would have had a resettlement route which would have made sense to the British people and would have provided political cover. Because even with the changes that we made, the 2005 election was substantially fought on immigration. It failed, but Michael Howard did push really hard with the advice of Linton Crosby from Australia on the migration issue. I think we need to see this, therefore, in terms of the politics of reaction to circumstances within and outside the country, which you in a democracy have to respond to. And the question is, do you do so wisely? Do you take advice? Do you have logical steps? And the politics of fear of change, fear of rapid cultural change and social norms, which then allows those who wish to use the issue of migration as a tool for electoral success, are able to whip up fear and sometimes discrimination. And I think you need to see the two in parallel, and sometimes, regrettably, they overlap. There's no question at all that all of us who have been in the difficult job of Home Secretary have at some point in time used the signalling that is now the predominant policy initiative of the government of the day to actually discourage people from using routes which we believe are either dangerous or unacceptable. I take one really important issue of the moment, and that is whether they are acceptable migrants or unacceptable. So we've accepted 150,000 people from Hong Kong, and nobody blinks because they're considered to be the right, in quotes, the right sort of migrant. And so I think we need to understand the underlying tensions and issues here and come to terms with three things. One, how do you explain the true figures at the same time as taking action to reduce fear? How do you stop the fear of change and social and cultural norms actually undermining those policies of rational dialogue, which means internal policies for integration with diversity? And thirdly, how do you ensure that you don't score an own goal by, for instance, including full-time university students in the migration figures? And if you could manage to juxtapose those together, there is the possibility of using genuine evidence to be able to persuade people that you have a grip, you know what you're doing, you have secure borders, but you also have a welcoming policy, whether it's in terms of asylum and those genuinely at risk, those who are needed in our economy for work purposes and therefore work visas, and those who are in between, such as those from Ukraine or Hong Kong, who on a definition from the International Convention on Human Rights would not qualify, but are in circumstances which we believe it's right to let them in. I just conclude by saying there is an interchange. It doesn't always work between academia and an evidence base and the politicians. I'm working with Lucy Mablin at Sheffield and Joe Turner at York on the small boats issue, and I have ideas and solutions which I think would help based on my experience in 2002 in relation to the agreement with Nicolas Sarkozy, but that's perhaps for another day. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, David. And I think you've outlined there some of the complex series of factors which have shaped immigration to the UK and have impacted on public attitudes, and usefully drawn some distinctions there between immigration for work, immigration for study, and then immigration via the humanitarian routes, which include Hong Kong, which we have a particular programme of work on at British Future, which I won't say any more about yet, but you're welcome to look us up on that. So we have covered a lot of ground, and I think we're all agreed that migration is a very hot topic, and it's not going away, and it's going to probably feature quite strongly in the next general election campaign. We also need better policy. I think we're all agreed on that, better evidence-based policy. And I just want to inject a little bit of positivity into some of this, because you know, we've heard a lot about the dangers and around public attitudes, and that attitudes might worsen. But actually, if attitudes have softened over time, so particularly since 2015, I think the public's a lot more positive about immigration. And I think a future government does have permission, pragmatic permission from the public to pursue more positive immigration policies, and ones that can benefit employers, the economy, and society. So I think there's a positive side to this, as well as concerns for the future. But I want to thank you all for coming today. I want to particularly thank our brilliant speakers for their contributions and for opening up a very interesting and good discussion. And you can watch the session again on Catch Up. The recordings will be available via the Campaign for Social Science 24 Election Hub, which also has details of other events and activities of the campaign. So thank you very much for coming.